Alright guys, how's it going? After what felt like an eternity of 28nm and rebrands, we finally have AMD's response to Nvidia's Pascal architecture and their GTX 1080 and 1070 graphics cards. As you'll soon find out by watching this video, that's not really the case, as both companies have managed to avoid a head-on competition here, with Nvidia very much going for the high end, while AMD has squarely targeted the mainstream with their RX 480 graphics card, based of course on their new Polaris graphics architecture. Now I'm going to be doing a lot of videos on Polaris over the coming week, including a more in-depth technical look. I'll be taking a look at overclocking. I even bought a FreeSync monitor to check out FreeSync for the first time. And there will also be an interview with AMD's Jason Meggitt coming very soon. But for now, this is my review of the RX 480, and I will be looking at the card purely from a consumer perspective, and whether or not the RX 480 is a graphics card that you should be buying. Right, so let's start by taking a look at the graphics card itself. As far as reference graphics cards goes, it's a bit of a beauty. Very good looking card indeed, and I think that the new Radeon logo is starting to grow on me as well. In terms of length, you're going to need around 25cm in your case in order to fit this graphics card. Now on the bottom we can see that the PCB length is actually much shorter, as it is indeed a blower style of cooler. These blower style coolers are pretty common in reference graphics cards. You're going to need one 6-pin PCIe graphics card connector on your power supply in order to power this card. And finally, taking a look at the front of the card, we can see the 3 DisplayPort outputs and the 1 HDMI. So moving on to the specs of the Radeon RX 480. It has greater than 5 teraflops with 36 CUs and comes with a maximum boost clock speed of 1266 MHz. The card will come in a memory size of 4 or 8 GB of GDDR5 and a TDP or power of 150 watts maximum. AMD is touting the card as VR Premium, and of course comes with AMD FreeSync and is also compatible with DisplayPort 1.3 and 1.4 HDR. A lot of this stuff doesn't mean a great deal to many of you. What it really comes down to is, on paper, the card should be somewhere in between the R9 390 and R9 390X, or the GTX 970 to the GTX 980 level of graphics card. That's what the specs suggest, but let's see what the reality says. Right, so the benchmarks are really what you came here for, so let's get on with it. All benchmarks are taking at 1080p on ultra settings, because the truth of the matter is that RX 480 is a 1080p card. So the first one I'm going to start with is 3D Mark Firestrike. And even though this is a synthetic benchmark, the final results were actually very close to my final benchmark total results. In this benchmark, the 1080 was 76% faster than the RX 480, the 980 Ti was 41% faster than the RX 480, the 480 was 52% faster than the R9 285, and it was a massive 176% faster than the 750 Ti. A lot of people are going to be utterly dismayed at this result, because the RX 480 is clearly nowhere near the GTX 1080's class. Now, nobody expected it to be close, but the gap is absolutely enormous. So let's see if the 480 can put up a stronger showing in actual games. Moving on to The Witcher 3. Now once again we're on 1080p ultra settings. I decided to leave Hairworks on, mostly just to see how the new card coped with it. The results may be a little bit surprising, as compared to Firestrike, the 480 did make up a little bit of ground. The 1080 is still 69% faster though, with the 980 Ti being 38% faster. The 480 did appear to lose just a little bit of ground to the R9 285 however, and is now only 51% faster, and once again it is 177% faster than the 750 Ti. It's actually not too bad. The 1080 and the 980 Ti are clearly better, and it shows while playing, but given the demanding settings, the 480 put up a decent show. The 285 was barely playable, while the 750 Ti simply was not playable. So that's a pretty strong game for Nvidia. Now let's move on to what should be a strong game for AMD. I am of course talking about Ashes of the Singularity. Well, in actual fact, Ashes of the Singularity is not that strong a game for AMD any longer, and the results show it quite clearly. The 1080 is 63% faster than the RX 480, with the 980 Ti being 40% faster. 480 is however a massive 143% faster than the R9 285. On the crazy settings, even at 1080p, the R9 285 appears to be having a memory issue, hence the massive gap. As you might expect, that puts the 480 even further ahead of the 750 Ti. Right, so next up is Fallout 4, yet another GameWorks title. Once again, ultra settings, full God rays, all that stuff. And this one actually threw up a little bit of a surprise because the 1080 was only 48% faster than the RX 480, with the 980 Ti only being 37% faster. Once again, the 480 was around about 50% faster than the R9 285, and once again, it was 170+% faster than the 750 Ti. So pretty interesting, but compared to the rest of the benchmarks, Fallout 4 was the RX 480's strongest showing against the 1080. The benchmark was tested within Diamond City, and that may have been a factor here. Next up, I decided to mix it up a bit. Doom on OpenGL. Now, Doom is a really fun game, and the benchmarking is pretty good as well. Due to OpenGL, it really does strongly favour the Nvidia cards here, with the 1080 being 73% faster than the RX 480, and the 980 Ti being 59% faster. Once again though, the 480 is massively faster than the R9 285 at 108%, which again I believe may be an issue with VRAM there, and it is a massive 230% faster than the 750 Ti. The fact of the matter here is, looking at the FPS charts, the first three cards are basically equally playable. Yes, you get that little bit less latency with the 1080 and the 980 Ti, but the RX 480 is unbelievably smooth while playing the game. Truth be told, the R9 285 felt pretty decent at 49 FPS average as well. However, the 750 Ti, even at 30.9% average, had a few 1 to 2 second long pauses, which is indicative of a VRAM or bandwidth issue. And that's something I might take a look at a later date. Otherwise, the RX 480 is massively playable in Doom at 1080p ultra settings. And this is the OpenGL version, remember. We can expect more from Vulkan, but more on that later. Now moving on to Overwatch, where I tested the only multiplayer game. Now you might believe that multiplayer games are not easy to benchmark. However, I played Overwatch for many hours while benchmarking this. And truth be told, the average frame rates didn't deviate by that much. In the end, the 1080 was 75% faster than the RX 480, with the 980 Ti being 52% faster. The 480 once again 56% faster than the R9 285 and a massive 133% faster than the 750 Ti. Looking at the numbers on the chart, we can see that the first three cards are massively playable. Unless you're a professional player, I really highly doubt that you can tell the difference here between the first three cards. That said, the gap is absolutely massive, but if all you care about is getting great 1080p performance in Overwatch at around $200, the RX 480 is the card to get. Right, so the final benchmark. Total War Warhammer looks like it could end up being a pretty good one for AMD again. Once again, DX12 of course, although to be frank the game runs pretty well on DX11. The RX 480 does make up some pretty decent ground, however the 1080 is still a massive 49% faster, with the 980 Ti being 26% faster, and once again the RX 480 is around about that 50% faster than the R9 285. Curiously, the 750 Ti would not run the benchmark. Right, so that is that. And the average totals of all of these benchmarks are as follows. The GTX 1080 is 65% faster than the RX 480, with the 980 Ti being 42% faster than the RX 480 and the RX 480 being 52% faster than the R9 285, and you could say the R9 380 here. In the case of the R9 285, I ignored the Ashes of the Singularity and the Doom benchmarks because they look more like VRAM limitations there than true results. It's a bit of a shame that I didn't have an R9 390 or a GTX 970, but looking at results elsewhere, it seems rather clear that the RX 480 is around about the R9 390, slightly faster than the GTX 970 level. Right, so now moving on to power consumption, here are the average system power consumption numbers in watts while running the Firestrike graphics tests 1 and 2. This is for the entire system, so the CPU, the RAM, the motherboard and the graphics card. However, I have subtracted 10% based on the inefficiency of my power supply, which is running at around about 90% efficiency. So looking at the numbers, rather unsurprisingly, the GTX 980 Ti uses a lot more power than any other card, 272 watts system-wide. Next up is the GTX 1080 system at 226 watts of power, followed by the R9 285 system at 200 watts, and then the RX 480 at 187 watts of system power. The 750 Ti system is way below everything else, as it was of course built for that market that requires very low power. So if we then take those numbers and remove around about 50 watts for the rest of the system, we get numbers like this. On a card level, the GTX 1080 at 180 watts of TDP is drawing around about 176 watts of power, whereas the GTX 980 Ti at 250 watts TDP draws around 222 watts of power. The RX 480 at 150 watts of TDP draws 137 watts of power, whereas the R9 285 at 190 watts of power draws around 150 watts. Once again, the 750 Ti, built for that very low power market, only drawing 58 watts of power on a 60 watts of TDP. Now, if we just compare the GTX 1080 to the RX 480, the GTX 1080 consumes around 30% more power while delivering 65% more performance. One thing to note here is that the 8GB of VRAM does consume a minimum amount of power, so obviously on a lower power graphics card, that VRAM also takes up more relatively to the rest of the card. But that said, it's still pretty clear that the GTX 1080 is a more power efficient card, simply due to it delivering a lot more performance at the cost of the extra watts. Compared to the previous generation Maxwell GTX 980 Ti, the 980 Ti uses 62% more power to deliver 42% higher frame rate. So that kind of gives us an idea of where Polaris lies compared to the previous generation Maxwell and the current generation Nvidia Pascal architecture. Compared to AMD's previous generation R9 285, the RX 480 delivers around about 50% more performance using 10% less power. Again, however, remember that this is 8GB of VRAM compared to 2GB of VRAM. So if the R9 285 also had 8GB of VRAM, you would expect it to draw more power. AMD has definitely gone in the right direction. It's safe to say that I am not blown away here. However, it should be noted that AMD is using the RX 470 for their power numbers. The RX 470 has 4GB of VRAM and will also quite likely have lower clock speeds. So this gives me a hint as to what is going on here with the RX 480. In my last RX 480 analysis video, I made the suggestion that the card could potentially hit 1600 MHz and when overclocked to that level could perhaps be on par with a Titan X, at least in DX12 games. Well, that prediction is going to come back to haunt me big time, because after a few minutes of playing around with AMD's new Wattman, which I do not like the name of, Overdrive was a pretty good name, I thought, for an overclocking tool. But anyway, as I was saying, after a few minutes of playing around with it, it became crystal clear that this was not a very good overclocking graphics card. With a bit more playing around, it seemed likely that there was a power limit issue here. Simply by raising the power limit by 10-20%, the card was able to maintain over 1350 MHz, but it simply would not get near 1400 MHz for me. I will be taking a much more in-depth look at overclocking the RX 480 in a future video. But for now, it seems that GCN's old Achilles heel remains. The card is not a good overclocker, and when you start overclocking it, the power really goes up. The final thing I'm going to say about the card itself is, it's got a little bit of a whirring noise to the fan. Now my new case, my new PC, is built on the Fractal Design Define R5, which is a very quiet case, yet I was still able to hear a little bit of whirring noise coming from the fan. I wouldn't say that it was annoying, and I am actually quite susceptible to noise, but it's not silent, and I feel that most people will not be affected by it. Right, so by now some of you may be thinking, Jim, is there anything you like about this graphics card? And the answer to that is an emphatic yes. There is a lot to like about this graphics card. The power draw is really good. Yes, it's not as good as Pascal, but it's better than Maxwell. That is really good. But for me, there are two better reasons why I labelled this card as the consumer champion. It is $200. When was the last time you had a card of this performance level at $200? The 1080 may be 65+% faster. It also costs 3 times as much. The 1070 might be what, 50% faster overall? It costs twice as much. Take a look at this slide here. The overwhelming majority of gamers buy $100 to $300 graphics cards. 84%. The different types of people who buy graphics cards goes something like this. You have the top 1%. Less than 1% of people will buy the GTX 1080 this year and next. That is how many of those cards get sold. The simple fact of the matter is the number of people spending $700, even $600 on a graphics card is tiny. So the next type of person maybe buys something like the 1070 instead. Well, the number of people buying $450 graphics cards is also very, very small. And given that this is AMD's fastest graphics card coming this year, how long do you think it's going to take before the 1070 is down below $300? It's going to take over a year. So for now, the 84% of buyers, the overwhelming majority of gamers, only have one realistic choice of graphics card, and that is of course the RX 480. And it's not $300, it's $200. Now the 8GB version maybe comes in at $230, $240. The card probably doesn't even need 8GB of VRAM. But if I were you, I would try to get it anyway. $230, $240, you're talking about a card faster than the R9 390 at half the power draw. And $230, $240, that surely has to be worth it. The second thing I really like about the card is that going forward, it is just going to get faster. Or maybe more accurately, the Nvidia competition is going to get slower. Now this RX 480 will never beat the 1070. It's too far behind. You maybe find one or two corner case games, DX12 games, where it might just about be fast enough, but I really doubt it. That said, the gap will close over time. And I know this is true because the history proves it. Just over 4 years ago, Nvidia shocked the gaming world when they released the GTX 680 graphics card. 3 months previously, AMD had released the HD 7970, which became the world's fastest graphics card. It was a larger GPU, it had more memory and a bigger memory bus. Most people just thought it would hold on to the lead for a very long time, but that's not what happened. Nvidia's Kepler architecture was so much better that their smaller GPU with less memory came in at 8% faster than the HD 7970. Roll on to today's reviews, same website, reviewing the GTX 1080 8GB. If you now check the relative performance, but instead of looking for the performance of the GTX 1080, look at the performance of these older cards. Now, they no longer have a GTX 680 on their chart, it is a GTX 770, which was effectively the same GPU, just with a little bit of an overclock, slightly better power management, and more bandwidth due to faster memory. AMD's equivalent card to the 7970 is of course the R9 280X. Once again, it is the same silicon as the 7970, just a little bit faster. But this 8% lead that the GTX 680 had over the HD 7970 has not only evaporated, but it has completely swung in the opposite direction, and then some. The R9 280X, the old HD 7970, is now 19% faster than the GTX 770 or the old GTX 680. That is a swing of 28%, or more than an entire tier of card up. This is why the GTX 780 here only just beats out the R9 280X now. This card was almost 25% faster at launch. Okay, but some people will say that's a corner case. The 280X, the old 7970, was built with more legs. It had more bandwidth, it had larger memory pool, which is a fair comment. However, if we again go back to the GTX 680 review, rather than compare the 680 against the 7970, why not just compare the 680 against the 7870, where it was 30% faster on launch day 4 years ago. Now both these cards have 2GB of VRAM, and the GTX 680 had more bandwidth, so a 30% lead for a faster card on paper. Roll on to today, and again we're looking at the GTX 770, and this time we are now looking at the R9 270X. The same silicon as the HD 7970, just with a very small overclock and slightly faster memory. The lead is now down to 7%. 30% down to 7%. So it's not the memory that's done it, and it's not the bandwidth, because the GTX 770 has more bandwidth than the R9 270X. So what is it? Look at this ancient card, the R9 270X, above the GTX 950, above the GTX 760 now. The GTX 760 was the GTX 670. It was way ahead of the R9 270X back then. but now over 15% behind. There are multiple reasons for why this is, and we don't exactly know. I did touch on it before in my GameWorks video, that maybe Nvidia was intentionally nerfing their older cards. The 770, the 660 are the Kepler generation, the 960, 970, all that stuff is your Maxwell generation. We are now on to Pascal, and Nvidia's Volta architecture will be coming next year. But the history can't be denied. This isn't a fluke, this is over 20 games. Tech Power Up benchmarks about 20 games in every benchmark. And what's more, half of these are GameWorks titles. But it doesn't matter what it is that's doing it. All that matters is that it is happening. Whether AMD gets better drivers, whether Nvidia drivers get worse, whether GameWorks is having an effect someplace. But it's like I said, the RX 480 is never going to be fast enough to beat the GTX 1070. But that is not my point. My point is this, Nvidia will release a GTX 1060 and it will probably be faster than the RX 480. Maybe just by a little, but it's the same as Kepler all over again. It is the same as the GTX 680 all over again. The card will have less memory, coming in 3 and 6 gigabytes of memory. It will have less bandwidth. But more importantly, with Volta coming next year, it's just going to get slower over time. This is almost guaranteed. And the reason I'm so confident of this is stuff like this. Quantum Break, Gears of War even, Ashes of the Singularity and Hitman. You've just seen a bunch of benchmarks here where the RX 480 is a little bit ahead of the 970 GTX. But in DX12 games, you're talking more like 30%. That puts the 480 well above the 980, let alone the 970. Here's a slide I found very interesting. We know that Doom, the game I benchmarked, is OpenGL. AMD is claiming up to 45% faster when the Vulkan patch comes out soon. For the RX 480, now clearly I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to that. I very much doubt it will be anywhere near 45% faster. But even if it's 15 to 20% faster, it's almost like free performance going forward. There are going to be more DX12 games, there's going to be much more Vulkan games. The biggest problem with this RX 480 is it still sucks at DX11. It is still GCN. At its core, it is still GCN. And while that is bad for DX11, it is good for the future. It is good for DirectX 12. It is good for Vulkan. It is the exact opposite of what the GTX 1060, its true competitor, will be. And that is why, to me, the RX 480, a card which does disappoint me with its current DX11 performance, I am convinced that it will be a much faster card and is the only smart buy if you are one of those 84% in the $100 to $300 bracket. I honestly don't know what price the 1060 would have to be for me to believe otherwise, but it would need to be a lot cheaper than $200. Even if it's 10% faster now, it's going to be 30% slower in future. We've already seen the same thing happen once before, and there is no reason to believe it won't happen again. And that is why the RX 480 is a consumer champion graphics card. The reason it's so cheap is because AMD didn't hit their target. AMD wanted to give you a great card at a good price. Instead, you've got a good card at a great price. If your current graphics card is slower than a GTX 960, R9 285, R9 380, then this is likely to be the only upgrade that will make sense to you this year. Right, finally, I have a game giveaway to give away once again. It is Groundbreakers, which has just recently launched on Steam. 95% positive reviews, so it's like a nice little puzzle game. If you're interested in a chance to win it, simply leave a comment in the discussion below. As always guys, there's going to be a bunch of links, and I would guess there will be a ton of chat. I hope you enjoyed this review, and there will be many more in future. I'll catch you later guys.